Nicholas Walsh is with us. He's the Programme Manager for the AFL Coaches Association, working in the area of mental health as well. Nicholas, you're very welcome. Good evening to you, I think. What time is it down there at the moment?
Yeah, it's just coming up to 7:30. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome, Nicholas. Thanks for taking the call. Ger was just mentioning there, this is obviously one of the biggest sports, the biggest sport in Australia. What has the reaction been like to these games in 15 minutes going ahead behind closed doors?
Yeah, it's been an interesting sort of, week or 10 days as such, since probably 10 days ago when the AFLW stuff, the women's code, was basically told they were playing behind closed doors last weekend to where we are now, and the men's just about to, kick off in about 15 minutes time. It's been an interesting week. The AFL came out on St. Patrick's Day, the 17th, and told all the players that it would be a reduced competition from 22 games to 17. There's 18 teams in the competition, so that means that everyone plays each other once. It would be essentially behind closed doors, and it would be under a strict policy in line with the Australian government as well.
What is the reasoning behind that? Is it a situation where there's going to be less games now? Is it less games in a few months? Or where are the games going to be taken away? Because it seems like fairly wishful thinking that they're going to get this whole thing played.
Yeah, I think the way Gil McLaughlin, who's the head of the AFL here, he spoke last night about they don't see it as a 17-week season, to see it as 154 games to be played up until November time if needs be. Normally the season will go to the last weekend in September, but they've already spoken with Cricket Australia and other codes that use all the venues around the country as well, and there will be a little bit of leeway. The MCG, the main venue, may not be available right up until November, but they will have to sort of play that by ear and see how it lies. But I think it all lies in line with the current policy that's here in Australia at the moment, and Australia isn't as bad as Ireland yet, or obviously as bad as mainland Europe. But it's if you look at the COVID-19 case here, sort of 3 weeks ago, it was only less than 100 positive cases, where as of this evening there's something like 565, and there's cases, and there's been 6 deaths. So it is on the rise, but it's not in that phase at the moment where it's absolutely critical, as opposed to Italy's and Spain's and places like that. There's 23 million people or so living in Australia. It's obviously a very large continent. It's spread out, but the decision to play Australian rules tonight is one that's been sort of left people in the community feeling a little bit anxious, to be honest.
Yeah, because some measures obviously have been taken. Borders at the moment closed to non-Australian citizens. I understand, as you mentioned, 565 cases, a rise of 111 in the previous 24 hours ahead of your last announcement in Australia. So some measures have been taken. The figures are clearly on the rise, and yet these games are allowed to go on behind closed doors, which kind of chimes in with what Wayne Rooney was saying in the Sunday Times at the weekend, that footballers were being used like guinea pigs in the Premier League, that this idea of games going ahead behind closed doors from a footballer's perspective is actually kind of ridiculous, because what if a player contracts the virus?
And that is one of the key things. And the big thing and the big talk here is about limiting the interaction that these players have with the outside world. I know, I'm involved with a lot of players still, and I know these players have been self-isolating other than going to training. Their training bases have been removed from the norm. Their football departments have been basically uplifted and moved and taken away from everyone else that works in every other football department, whether it's marketing, membership, ticket sales, all that sort of stuff. It's complete separate now. So it's just the 40 odd players and coaching staff and a few peripheral staff. So there's probably only a cohort of around 70 people on any one given day that they interact with.
Right.
So in line with government regulations here, anything under 100 indoors is deemed safe. And anything outdoors under 500 is deemed safe. So that's one of the reasons why the games can go ahead tonight. And I think the chief medical officer from the Australian government played a pivotal role in this yesterday when he met with the AFL Commission and board and basically reiterated the case of those numbers around the 100 and the 500 in terms of essential or non-essential gatherings. So that's why there's been a total lockout, but that's why the games are allowed to go ahead.
Because that's one of the interesting things at the moment is, with regards to these setups, we sometimes don't know how many people players are in contact with or coaches are in contact with. But from what you were saying there, the AFL have actually come up with a few measures to ensure that the contact time between one individual and the other is limited greatly.
Yeah, correct. And even Gil McLaughlin stated in his press conference yesterday that like the both changing rooms are obviously opposite ends of the ground. They're limiting those well under the 100 mark. I think there's something only on like under 70 because there's only 22 players at any one given time. There, one emergency player, which would be 23. You're talking a bit around backroom staff, coaches. You're probably not talking anywhere over 45 people in those changing facilities or changing rooms at any one time, and these changing rooms are a bit like Crow Park, where there's lots of room. There's a warm up area. It's not your old club rooms of Terry Coyle Park or anything like that you're talking about.
One of the concerns that you would have perhaps is the financial implications of all of this, playing games in front of no fans whatsoever. It's going to affect finances. Is it going to affect the livelihoods of any of our young Irish footballers down in Australia at the moment, those especially on the periphery of these teams?
Yeah, I definitely will. Look, the rough figure that's come out this week is that all players will have to take a 20% pay cut. And obviously the young Irish players, the first and second year players, are only probably on around 80 or 100,000 Aussie dollars. Which is low in comparison to some of the stars that are on nearly $1 million over here. So taking 20% of a pay cut and the cost of living and whatnot, especially in Sydney and Melbourne, which are pretty expensive places to live in probably on par with Dublin at the moment. So taking a bit of a pay cut in that regard is pretty heavy. And Eddie Maguire, who's the president of Collingwood Football Club, he's probably the most famous, if not, he was even chosen as the chef de mission on the international rules a few years ago for Australia. He just came out this evening and he reckons that the industry could lose up to 500 million Aussie dollars this year, which is a financial downfall. And he reckons that the game could go under, but hopefully there's a plan B in place as well with all this.
Wow, that's like a fairly stark warning, especially given the popularity of the sport in Australia. Like if you had to pick one sport in Australia, you might have almost said the AFL is the one that might be most protected from going under.
Yeah, well, look, there's pros and cons, and that's probably one of the reasons why, once the government deemed it safe to go ahead tonight, that TV ratings and sponsorship on TV and different things can still be sold, and that's one of the major benefits to keeping the sport alive. And yes, there will be some tough times ahead, but I think just my boss this evening, the Coaches Association CEO Mark Brayshaw, he's come out and he's taken a pay cut of 20,000, as is all the AFL professional coaches in the game as well. So that's a major win for the association straight away.
The AFLW is still set to go ahead, Nicholas, but at the same time, Niamh McAvoy and Sinead Goldrick have been advised to go home, and I understand they're currently in the air at the moment. But what's the situation there?
Yeah, it's interesting because there was only 2 rounds to go in the AFLW before finals. So basically the AFL made the decision that so there was 2 conferences, there were 16 teams and the 2 groups of 8. So they decided in line with the men's fixture that they will give it 3 weeks to play out. This is the estimated time that it's going to get worse in Australia. And essentially they've made now the 2 conferences have become one, so the 2 top 4 sides have been migrated, and there's a final series over the next 3 weeks. And I know Melbourne Football Club are very proactive about Niamh and Sinead, and they contacted the Irish Embassy in relation to the safety of the players first. And I think it's a very selfless act that what the Melbourne Football Club have done essentially. And I know other clubs have been in contact as well, but as of tonight, I believe only Sinead and Niamh are the only 2 that appear to have left to go back to Ireland, as opposed to the teams that are left in the competition. The other teams like Ash McCarthy and the girls that are playing for the Bulldogs, I believe they were getting on a flight sometime this week. But yeah, it's a strange decision. They're into their sort of quarter final, I guess it's the equivalent of back home. Would have been in the semi-final next weekend and a grand final the following weekend if they would have went on. And I think they put like family first, and the club basically said no, they've done great service. So the embassy basically said they advised them that players should go home, and yeah, they basically got on the plane at 5:30 this evening Australian time.
Right. It's mad because there's such a situation now where, as you said at the top, you look at the figures and you look at the trajectory Australia is going in, and obviously what's happening here in Europe. When these players touch down here in Europe, there could be a situation where they'll be trapped, and certainly getting back into Australia will prove very, very difficult over the next few weeks and months. Like, it does pose questions over the short-term international recruitment of the AFL and the AFLW at the moment, doesn't it? It seems like an impossible task almost if they want to look outside of the country ahead of next season.
Yeah, definitely. So what the AFL normally do around Easter time is to bring over, 4 or 5, 17, 18-year-olds to look at bringing into next year's draft. I know they did that last year with the likes of Ross McQuillan and Keane McBride and a few others like that, and young Tui up in the Gold Coast. And so essentially those players won't be obviously brought out this year. They won't be able to have any sort of group interaction through Marty Clark's program back in Ireland with the AFL, and I can't see at this stage any Irish players being identified in time to go into next year's draft if that timing goes ahead. So yeah, you're right. The short-term implication will have its sort of detriment because, as you know, Irish players are seen as a free pick in a way to some Australian clubs, and what they do is they don't sit in under the salary cap. So it's actually, it sits outside the salary cap, so they can actually have up to 2 Irish players on a list at any one time and keep developing them. So that program will obviously take a bit of a hit, and there'll be, jobs lost through the AFL for that as well.
Nicholas, I just wanted to ask you a question. The way that we've seen this develop across Europe and the world is that the gatherings have gone from nothing over 5,000 to nothing over 1,000 to nothing over 500, and eventually all in the country so far have ended up cancelling stuff. Is it at the stage where social distancing is actually happening on the streets in Australia? Are people still going to bars and pubs? I guess I'm really asking, is the country taking this seriously just yet?
Yeah, the country is taking it seriously. They're being very proactive. There's a lot of real positive interaction with the government messages, and Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, he's coming out every second day, as of late, and basically reassuring what's happening is going in the right direction. As the saying is, they're trying to smooth out that curve, similar to everywhere in the world. But the message is they are taking it one day at a time, and it's dramatically changing over the course of time. So to answer your question in relation to public spaces and whatnot, there hasn't been full lockdown. There's been recommendations through the working spaces. I know in our working space we're now split into A, B teams. Half of us are working one day, half of us are working the other day, and alternate days we're working from home. So there isn't full shutdown yet. Schools aren't fully shut down. There is some schools that have opted to basically shut down themselves. There is some cases in some schools, and they opted to close their doors as well. But in terms of public transport, restaurants, different things like that, they are still open, but numbers are just dwindling. I literally went down to get some takeaway food last night, and essentially there was no one in the restaurant. And on a Wednesday night in Melbourne, it's normally jam packed, and the food you're able to walk in, walk out straight away without even having to wait for your food to be ready as such.
Right.
Because the Premier League was going to go ahead with games until Mikel Arteta ended up testing positive for coronavirus. And if any of those AFL players actually have kids, and those kids are at school, it's all well and good limiting the people in the building. You just don't know the kids have come in contact with whoever. So how long do you think this is going to continue? It's going to continue indefinitely. Is that the plan at the moment?
Yeah, I think so. What we're hearing, like through the media and through the different press conferences, is that until there is a positive test in the men's game or the women's game, that's when they will cease for a 2-week period. So what they're trying to do before this spread gets even bigger is to get in as many games as possible over the next, say, 3 to 4 weeks, then potentially take a period of leave or or postponement of time, and then reconvene after a period of time as well. What they also have done is taken measures around games where they've reduced the timing around games from 20 minutes per quarter per time onto around 16, and they're allowed an extended bench as well. So there's more sort of interchange players allowed on and off as well. So they have put measures in, because traditionally it's you play every Saturday or Sunday in AFL, like one game a week for 22 rounds straight. What the players have said is they're willing to play up to 2 games a week if needs be, and hence why they brought in reduced time and more numbers on the bench as well.
Nicholas, just before we let you go, I mentioned at the top you're working in mental health as part of your role with the AFL Coaches Association, I understand. What challenges is that going to pose for you over the next couple of weeks? Have you already started to formulate in your head some of the advice you'll be giving? Because it's a challenging time for people once lockdown happens, and especially for athletes who rely on activity so much as a part of their day-to-day life.
Yeah, definitely. And if you look at the strand of the AFL, there's 18 professional teams. There's 3,500 community AFL clubs in Australia. They feed into one of those 18 teams, so there is an aligned link back to them. And what our program does is essentially service those community coaches. There's around 50 to 60,000 community coaches in Australia. Basically, what we've built is a mental health program to help coaches understand, recognise and manage signs of mental health. And what we're doing over this next period of time, so essentially what the AFL have done they've brought in a community policy to say that all playing of games at community level is banned until, or postponed until, the 31st of May. No workshops, no face-to-face events, no coaching clinics, no games, nothing like that, because they can't control the masses in the community setting. So they've basically put a total ban on it. So what we've offered the state leagues and communities just of today, we had something like 15 of the local leagues online, and we're actually adopting our program from a face-to-face method to an online method, and we're going to bring all our courses online via Skype or Zoom, and have basically, educate our coaches at that time of self-isolation / boredom maybe, when they're sitting at home and not watching games or TV and wanting to educate themselves. So hopefully when the season starts again for a community around June 1st, that they're refreshed and ready to go, and they're in a good state mentally as well.
Yeah, and for any club GA player watching this, or for any sports person watching this, indeed, Nicholas, is there any advice you'd have for people, I guess, in any country around the world at the moment who've been struggling with this, who don't have their hobby to go to, who don't have their club training or whatever it is to go to on an evening?
Yeah, look, I'm not a psychologist, but I would recommend, social connection is a big thing, even though we're talking about social isolation at the moment. But don't be afraid to jump on a Skype or a Zoom or pick up the phone and have a real conversation. That's one of the big things. And, there's times where, it's going to be challenging. And on Tuesday, on Paddy's Day here, it was really challenging because I was told I couldn't deliver my program, over the next few months. And there's a lot of planning and stuff. And that's the sort of stuff I was struggling with. But with good group of people and, good family and different thing around you, that, you can have conversations and you can move up and down that mental health continuum on any given day. So there's going to be periods where we're all struggling during this time. There's going to be a lot of stress and anxiety, but there's heaps of podcasts, there's heaps of documents, there's heaps of videos that you can tap into through different online resources that you can get out there. So I'd recommend to anyone to, have a conversation, ask people how they're going and follow up with that on a daily basis.
Absolutely. Well, Nicholas Walsh, it's been great chatting to you. Thanks a million for taking the call.